All right, we'll go back on the record. State of Wisconsin versus Tod Kendhammer, 16 CF 909, same appearances as before. We're outside the presence of the jury at this point. Anything either side wishes to put on the record before the jury comes in?
Yes, Your Honor. We were informed by somebody that was watching the live feeds that during some breaks or maybe between witnesses, some media outlets pan around the courtroom or maybe zoom out and it's capturing some of the jurors. So we want to bring that to your attention.
Okay. Well, I would hope the media respects the privacy of the jurors and does not do that. The jurors generally go straight out when we call the break, so they should wait to pan out until the jurors are completely out of the room and not have it panned out when they're coming in the room either. So I hope the media can continue to respect that. I can talk to them during a break if I need to further. All right, anything else?
No, Your Honor. No, sir.
Okay. All right, if the jury's ready, bring them in. All right, may all be seated. Okay, we'll continue with Mr. Grinke, calling his next witness.
State will call Trooper Marquardt.
Under penalties of perjury, do solemnly, sincerely, and truly declare and affirm that the testimony you're about to give in this matter shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
I do. 144. 143. Okay, thank you. CV's 143. Thank you. Could you state your name?
Michael James Marquardt.
How were you employed?
I'm a trooper with the Wisconsin State Patrol.
Your Honor, the parties have stipulated that Exhibit 143 can be admitted.
Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, 143 will be received.
Trooper Marquardt, what is Exhibit 143?
It's a copy of my curriculum vitae, essentially my professional resume.
What are your duties with the State Patrol?
I'm assigned to a specialty unit within the State Patrol called the Technical Reconstruction Unit, or the TRU. It's a group of approximately 14 people spread throughout the state, and we're tasked with investigating serious injury and fatality vehicle crashes. So I'm an investigator for the State Patrol.
How long have you been employed in that capacity?
Well, I've been with the State Patrol for over 19 years now. I've been doing crash reconstruction since 2002, so approximately 15 years. I've been with the TRU since its inception, which was fall of 2006.
When you do crash reconstruction, what scientific disciplines are involved in that?
It's relatively basic physics, comes from Sir Isaac Newton's stuff, his laws of motion. I explain it. If you attend college and you go to a Physics 101 course, the textbook that they hand you in that course on day number 1 is essentially the rudimentary physics that we deal with.
And have you been involved in investigating crashes involving all types of vehicles?
Yes.
Do you have any idea how many crashes you've been involved in investigating?
We don't keep rigid numbers anymore, especially after 15 years. Somewhere in the vicinity of 1,000 cases I've done myself. If I do 50, 60 cases a year, I'm probably at another 20 or 30 cases where I'm the assisting reconstructionist due to caseload or something. Someone else is going to take the primary aspect of that case. So if you multiply 60 or 70 times 15 years, that tells you where I'm at.
What is the purpose of crash reconstruction?
We're going to scenes. First off, if there's a potential for a crime. We travel to those scenes and we try to figure out 2 main questions: how the crash happened, why the crash happened. The how aspects are things like speeds of vehicles, lane position, perhaps who was the driver. The why aspects may lean more towards human factors, intoxication or drugs or choice, those types of things.
The parties have also agreed and stipulated that Exhibit 144 can be admitted.
Is that correct?
That is correct, Your Honor,
144 will be received.
but not,
Not in its entirety, we'll be pointing out excerpts from it.
In other words, we'll admit the report, but not,
That's fine, it'll be
Not
received.
published.
That's fine.
Trooper, what is Exhibit 144?
It's a narrative report that I completed following a request by your office to be able to review a defense witness's report.
And in preparation of that report, did you review police reports?
I did.
And you had conversations with La Crosse County Sheriff's Department about some of the facts?
I did.
I'm directing your attention to page 3 of your report. There's a title in the middle of the page that says time/distance analysis.
Yes.
In that paragraph, there's a sentence that talks about an object that is free-falling under the acceleration of gravity. Can you explain what you mean by the acceleration of gravity?
Sure. We're on Earth. We're all experiencing gravity right now. Things free fall in Earth's gravitational field at a constant. That constant is 32.2 feet per second. Sorry, too fast? I tend to do that. Thank you. It falls at 32.2 feet per second. That's a constant. If we were standing on top of this building, we dropped a baseball off, that baseball would fall to the ground at that rate.
How does horizontal forces apply, and how does that affect gravity?
If horizontal forces were applied, that would be an outside force, and so that would affect the falling rate, or it does not affect the falling rate, excuse me. An example of that might be throwing of the ball. It's still going to fall from a known height to a lower height at that 32.2 feet per second, but obviously it will travel a distance depending on how hard you throw it.
In this particular case, then, did you determine how high the hole in the windshield we've been talking about was from the ground?
Yes,
What was that height?
4.02 feet.
And were you also familiar with the statement given by the defendant to law enforcement?
Yes,
And were you aware of what he described as a pipe coming off a truck, that scenario?
yes.
And what kind of a truck did he say was used to have this pipe fall off?
My understanding was what I'd call a flatbed pickup truck.
And did you attempt to calculate how high that pipe might have fallen from?
We did, yes, or I did.
How did you determine that?
We looked at that statement. We made an estimate of what a typical flatbed style pickup truck's bed would be height-wise. The defendant also talked about the fact that that truck had some type of a side rail on it. He had estimated, or they had estimated somewhere within those reports, that it was between 18 and 24 inches. So with a 4-foot high truck bed with a 24-inch side rail, that works out to be 6 feet. So our starting height for the pipe at that point would have been 6 feet high.
And easy math then, a height of 6 feet falling to about 4 feet is about 2 feet of a fall.
That's correct.
Did you calculate how much time it would take for a pipe to drop those 2 feet?
Yes, that horizontal distance that it falls in Earth's gravitational field at 32.2 feet per second works out to be 0.352 seconds, or approximately 1/3 of a second.
Now, there's obviously some variables that could change. To have more than 1/3 of a second, or 0.352 seconds, to see or observe this falling object, what variable would have to change?
If you principally change the height that it would start from, that would be the d, or the distance element in the mathematical formula.
Any other variables?
You could change a time component perhaps, or something to that effect, but not in this particular instance, no.
And you talked about the rate of falling objects due to the laws of gravity. Does that apply to every object?
As long as there isn't wind resistance or some type of aerodynamic forces, if it's not a glider that's flying with wings, or it doesn't have a large surface area where as it's falling, the wind would be essentially slowing it down. If you think of a parachutist, the difference when free fall, when they have their hands straight out from them, versus when they're kind of in a pike position and they're just screaming, coming down, that would be terminal velocity or free fall. So if the pipe had some type of aerodynamic properties that it would fly, then it would affect things.
That's all I have from this witness, Your Honor.
Mr. Hurley?
good morning.
Good morning.
was watching a football game last night, and the quarterback was throwing the football. And what is the effect of the velocity of the object on how long it will remain aloft?
Well, remember, football has some aerodynamic properties.
I understand that. But my question was, what's the effect of the velocity of the object on how long it will remain aloft?
Meaning if he throws it harder or softer, it
Correct.
should stay longer in the air or less long in the air?
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, that would be correct.
Okay. What was the velocity, assuming there was a pipe that came through the windshield while Mr. Kendhammer was driving, what was the velocity of the pipe?
Meaning what would it be traveling when it fell off of the truck? Is that correct?
If it fell off of the
If it
truck.
fell off the truck.
Right.
We have to make a couple of assumptions. We'd have to make some assumptions in regards to how fast each of the vehicles were traveling.
And do you know how fast that other vehicle would have been traveling?
Other than it being a 55-mile-per-hour zone and assuming that people would travel at or near the posted speed limit, obviously we don't know what that vehicle would have been traveling.
Right, and if we made that assumption that people traveled at the speed limit, neither you nor I would have jobs, correct?
Correct.
In this matter, you said you were provided with a report of Mr. Kendhammer's statements, correct?
It was a transcript of an interview that was conducted by one of the detectives.
And would that have been Mark Yealy?
Yes.
Were you provided with the statements that Mr. Kendhammer had given that morning also to Officer Leffelholtz,
No.
to Officer Wickland?
No.
Were you provided with either the transcript or the viewing of a 3-hour-long interview that he gave to investigator Mark Leinfelder?
No.
So in essence, you relied upon the statement given to Officer Yaley, in which he said that he thought that the pipe had rolled off of a truck, a flatbed truck, correct?
I don't believe he used the word thought, though. I think he was pretty adamant in regards to what he saw. Is that what you're referencing, sir?
Well, you saw the transcript, correct?
Yes.
You did not hear the interview?
Well, we actually have quotes from the transcript here that I utilized. I can certainly read those if you'd
No,
like me to.
I understand what you're saying. Did you hear the interview?
Meaning, was I present when the interview was
No,
conducted?
did you hear the recording of the interview?
No, I did not.
Were you aware of his emotional state at the time he gave that information?
No.
Because you did not hear the other interviews, you did not ever hear him say that at first he thought it was a bird. Is that correct?
I believe even within my statements and within that interview, there was something that he indicated that. I used a pretty large quote there so that we had some context of things. I can certainly look for that if you'd like me to.
If one thought that something was a bird, is it logical then to think that a bird rolled off of a truck?
That would call for me to speculate. I guess I don't know.
Did you observe in reading the transcript let me rephrase it. One of the things in the transcript provided you that he said was, I didn't see, I didn't even look at the truck, correct?
I believe that that was a statement after he explained that he saw it roll off the truck. So there must have either been some confusion on his part, potentially, or he didn't understand the question. That was kind of me reading into that, but
Right.
if I'm like explaining that correctly.
Exactly, but listen to my question, because we'll get to those things. Did he also say, I wasn't looking?
Can I reference this just to
Yes,
be
sir.
sure that I'm answering
Yes,
truthfully on
sir.
that?
I am on page 2 of your report, at parent 2, about in the middle.
So where I've got the subscript 3, page 9 of the transcript, is that about in the middle there?
Let me show you what I'm looking at, so we're both literally on the same page.
Please.
Right here,
Very good. No, I was off.
okay?
Could you please repeat the question again for me, sir?
I'm just going to read to you from what you have in your report. You quote him as saying, or you quote him as saying from the transcript that you read, I didn't even look at the truck. I honestly, Mr. Yaley says, didn't look like it. Mr. Kendhammer says, I wasn't looking. Mr. Yaley says, okay. And Mr. Kendhammer says, I wasn't looking at the scene. It had he had a bunch of stuff in there, I'm sure because it was taller up. Did I read that correctly?
That is correct.
And he says, he had some sides, metal sides on it. Mr. Yaley says, okay. Mr. Kendhammer says, and I don't know what else, correct?
And that's further down within it, is that correct?
That's
sir?
correct.
Very good, yes.
Did I read that correctly?
I believe so, yes.
And again, you quote from page 9 of the transcript. Here I'm at your parent 3, and I'm going down about 6 lines. Mr. Kendhammer says, I looked up to see that vehicle and something like a bird is coming right at us, correct?
That is correct.
And subsequently he says, and it looked like a bird, correct?
Yes.
So you had 2 things within one statement. One is seeing it roll off the truck, and the other is thinking it's a bird. Is that correct?
Yes.
And your conclusions are premised on the notion that he saw it roll off a truck. Is that correct?
Well, we have to have a starting point for a time-distance solution at some point, and that would be the starting point for it.
So you chose one over the other, correct?
How would you choose the bird aspect of it to be able to conduct a time-distance analysis, sir?
Well, I'm not conducting the analysis. I'm just, you were asked to conduct a time-distance analysis of what, precisely?
In relation to the statements that Mr. Kendhammer provided,
Okay, but one of those statements said, I thought it was a bird, correct?
and immediately prior to that, he states, if I can quote, so did you actually see it come off of the flatbed? Did I? Yeah. I seen it when it started coming off. I mean, it like rolled off and was headed right. I mean, okay, what else was he hauling, et cetera, et cetera?
Correct.
That's
But
one
that's
of
not
about
con-
4 statements.
My apology. However, that's not consistent with thinking it's a bird, correct?
That's correct.
So you had to choose between 2 statements in order to perform your analysis, correct?
But we knew it was a pipe, according to the statement.
Subsequently, one knew it was a pipe, correct?
By subsequently, at my point, it brought into the investigation,
That's correct.
yes, we knew that it was a pipe.
Subsequently, one knows it's a pipe. There are other ways that a pipe can be kicked aloft. Is that correct?
In reference to this particular case,
Are there other ways in which a pipe can be made to go aloft?
but we didn't analyze other ways, sir.
I know you didn't. I'm asking you a question. Please listen to my question, because most of them you can answer with yes or no. There are other ways in which a pipe can be kicked aloft. Is that correct?
But I didn't analyze any other way in regards to my testimony today.
What was my question, sir?
But you're asking me to extend beyond
What
what my
was my
testimony
question?
is?
What was my question, sir?
If I understood correctly, it was, are there other ways that the pipe could be kicked?
Aloft.
Kicked aloft?
Yes.
Kicked aloft.
What is the answer to that? Yes or no?
Yes.
Your report and your testimony are premised on the notion that the truck was a pickup-style flatbed with an 18-inch to 24-inch side rail. Is that correct?
Yes.
And it is premised on the notion that the pipe fell from such a truck. Is that correct?
Yes,
If your assumptions are incorrect, your conclusion would be incorrect. Is that a fair statement?
likely yes, but not necessarily. Obviously, there could be more than one answer in regards to physics on this, if you understand what I'm saying by that. I'm trying to be as truthful as possible, but I think that you're saying in totality, yes.
No further questions.
Ranky, anything else?
Yes. Trooper Marquardt, you were first asked about a scenario about quarterback throwing a football. Do you remember that?
Yes,
In that scenario, is there an upward force applied to an object?
there is.
In this scenario, any object falling off a truck, whether it be pickup or flatbed, would there be a person applying an upward force to an object?
To the best of my knowledge, in this scenario, there was not someone standing in the back of the pickup truck throwing the pipe off.
You asked about the speeds of the vehicles. If the speed limit's 55, just to use round numbers, if we assume both vehicles were going 50, and they're coming towards each other, how fast is a pipe going when it comes off a truck traveling 50 miles an hour?
Well, the closing distance between the two objects would be their combined speeds. So in this instance, if they're both doing 50, it would be 100 miles per hour.
So if they're both doing 60, it's 120.
Yes,
Does that affect that fall distance and the time calculation that you made,
it does not. Things fall at 32.2 feet per second.
regardless of the speed that they're traveling?
That is correct.
Was there any information that you were given that you received that this was not a flatbed truck?
No, in fact, it was the opposite.
If a person doesn't see an object at first or recognize what it is or think it's a bird, does that reduce the amount of time they have to react?
It may.
If we start with your 0.352 seconds timing of how long it would take for the pipe to fall that distance, that would mean if the person saw it that entire time, they'd have to see it from the start to the finish.
That is correct.
If they didn't see it at first, we're cutting into that 0.352 seconds.
Yes, time would be reduced then.
You've been familiar with objects falling off of vehicles in other cases?
Yes,
You were asked a question about what could cause an object to become aloft. Does it require some kind of force?
it does, an outside force.
That's all I have.
Really, anything else?
I have no further questions, sir.
At this time, does any juror have a question of Trooper Marquardt? I don't see any hands. All right, Trooper Marquardt, you may step down. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Release the exhibits.
State will call Kevin Scott.
Under penalties of perjury, do you solemnly, sincerely, and truly declare and affirm the testimony about to give in this matter shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
So which one, number 2 is 86? No problem. The other would be number 13? 15 is... And 13?
And the other diagrams are what numbers? 88, 89?
Can you state your name?
My name is Kevin Scott.
Mr. Scott, how are you employed?
I am a DNA analyst at the Wisconsin State Crime Laboratory in Madison, Wisconsin.
I believe the parties have stipulated that Exhibit 85 can be admitted.
That's correct.
85 will be received.
Mr. Scott, can you identify what Exhibit 85 is?
This is my CV.
How long have you worked as an analyst for the crime lab?
I've been a DNA analyst at the crime lab for nearly 5 years.
And what is your educational background?
I received a Bachelor of Science degree from UW-Madison in biochemistry.
Have you received any training pertaining to forensic DNA testing?
Yes, I received nearly 1 year of in-house training at the crime lab in Madison, which included every aspect of DNA analysis performed at the lab, and also approximately 3 months of supervised casework training under a senior DNA analyst.
What are your duties and responsibilities as a DNA analyst?
I examine crime scene evidence for the presence of biological materials such as blood, semen, and saliva. I attempt to extract or release DNA from these biologic materials or from any other source of DNA such as skin cells. I then analyze those DNA results and make comparisons to DNA standards taken from known individuals. I then prepare a written report of my laboratory results and conclusions.
What is DNA?
DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. It is the genetic material that is present in all living organisms. It is the blueprint that codes for all structures and functions within our bodies. We inherit DNA from our parents. We receive half of our DNA from our mother and half from our father. In addition, DNA is the same throughout your body, regardless of the source. So DNA from your saliva should match the DNA from your skin, should match the DNA from blood within your body.
What is touch DNA?
Touch DNA commonly refers to DNA that might be left behind from skin cells after an individual might touch an object.
What makes DNA useful?
DNA is used in a forensic setting in a laboratory because two different people should have identifiable differences in their DNA at certain locations. In our laboratory, we analyze certain genetic markers, these locations where DNA is known to differ between two individuals. We can then test items of evidence and compare those to standards taken from known individuals to attempt to determine if an individual's DNA is present on that object or not. And any two people should have different DNA profiles with the exception of identical siblings.
What is a DNA profile?
A DNA profile is essentially just a list of numbers that represents the genetic markers or the locations that we test for. So when we examine an item of evidence and we test for these genetic markers, we generate this list of numbers. A DNA profile from an item of evidence can either be single source, so it can originate from just one individual, or it can be a mixture of DNA that would result. It would be a mixture of DNA from multiple individuals.
What is STR DNA analysis?
STR stands for short tandem repeat. This is the type of DNA analysis that we perform in our lab. These short tandem repeats are just repeating segments of DNA that occur at these genetic markers or locations that we test for. Your DNA profile is simply the number of repeats. So if a certain segment of DNA repeats 13 times, your profile might be a 13.
Can a DNA profile include DNA from multiple individuals?
Yes, if I examine an item of evidence and there is DNA from 2 individuals on that item, I would expect to develop a DNA mixture profile.
What are DNA mixtures?
A DNA mixture would be a profile that would result from 2 individuals' DNA being mixed together. When I analyze an item of evidence, I would generally take a swabbing or cutting from that item, and when I extract the DNA, I would extract all the DNA that is present on that object. So if there's DNA from 2 individuals on that object that I'm extracting, I would generally develop a mixture profile.
How do you make comparisons?
So first I would examine the item of evidence and develop the DNA profile from that item of evidence. I would then develop, using the same methods, I would develop a DNA profile from a standard taken from a known individual. This is generally a buccal standard, which is a swabbing of your inside cheek, so it only contains DNA from that one individual. Or it can be a dried blood standard as well. I then compare the evidence profile to the profile developed from the standard, and if that evidence profile matches the standard profile, or if the individual's profile is present in a mixture profile, I would say that that person is included as a possible contributor to the evidence profile.
Do you perform statistical analysis on the DNA profile that you develop?
Yes, anytime a standard profile matches an evidence profile, I perform a statistical analysis on that evidence profile in order to estimate how common that profile might be. In the case of a single source profile, we perform a statistical analysis to determine how often you might see that profile in a general population, or in the case of a mixture profile, we might do a statistical analysis to determine the probability of randomly selecting an individual who could be a possible contributor to that mixture.
Can you determine what kind of cell or body fluid the DNA profile came from?
Generally, no. When I extract a evidence sample, I would extract or release all of the DNA that is present on that item that I'm testing. This could be DNA from skin cells, from blood, anything that could have DNA. There is no way for me to tell, looking at the DNA profile, what specific cell that DNA may have come from.
Can you determine how long DNA has been on an item?
Generally, no. When I examine the item of evidence, I would get all the DNA that is present on that item as I receive it. I cannot tell generally exactly how long that DNA had been there. It might have been there for years. It might have just been placed on right before I sampled. It's impossible for me to tell.
Do you know how long a DNA might stay on an item?
DNA can degrade with time or due to the elements. If a DNA stays around for many, many years, the amount of DNA might decrease just due to degradation and getting old, or if it's out in the elements, it might be washed away, that sort of thing.
88, 89 can be admitted.
That's correct.
All right, court will receive 86, 87, 88, and 89 based on the agreement.
Starting first, Mr. Scott, with item 86, can you identify that?
Item 86 appears to be a report that I authored dated December 2nd, 2016.
And can you identify exhibit number 87?
Exhibit 87 appears to be another report that I authored dated May 2nd, 2017.
And would these reports include your DNA analysis in this case?
That is correct.
And can you identify what is exhibit 88?
88 appears to be a photocopy taken from my case notes of a photo with some annotations of a pipe.
You have to step back a little bit.
Of a pipe.
Pipe. And 89?
89 is also a photocopy of my notes with a photo and annotations of a pipe.
Starting first with your report dated December 2nd, it's item exhibit 86. There were a number of items that you analyzed in this case. Starting with items B and C, what were those items?
Item B are right-hand fingernail clippings that were reportedly recovered from Barbara Kendhammer. Item C are left-hand fingernail clippings reportedly recovered from Barbara Kendhammer.
Did you test those items B and C for the presence of blood?
Yes, I did. Both items B and C were positive for the possible presence of blood.
And when you say possible presence of blood, what do you mean by that?
When I test for the possible presence of blood, I perform a presumptive test. This test is a color change test. If blood is present on the item, we would expect the test to turn bright pink. If blood is not present on that item, we would expect the test to not change color. However, there are substances out there that can make the test turn pink even without the presence of blood. Therefore, we would use this as a presumptive test for the possible presence of blood.
What are those other items that might also test positive for blood?
There are some other plant items such as horseradish or rust or some metals that might change, make a color change.
Did you say horseradish?
Yes, I believe so.
You further designated those clippings as B1, B2, B3, B4, and B5.
Yes, each item B and C contained 5 clippings. I sub-designated each item as a separate item. So one clipping would be item B1, second clipping would be item B2, etc.
So first let's talk about item B1, which would be one fingernail clipping from the right hand of Barbara Kendhammer. What was the result of the DNA analysis on that item?
So I took a washing of this fingernail clipping. So I placed the one fingernail clipping from the right hand into liquid and vortexed it. So I shook it up a lot, trying to attempt to remove any DNA that might be on that fingernail clipping. I then performed my DNA analysis on that washing, and I developed a profile that is a mixture of DNA from at least 2 individuals. Tod Kendhammer and Barbara Kendhammer were both included as possible contributors to that mixture. And if we assume that DNA from Barbara Kendhammer is present on her own fingernails, it is at least 46 quadrillion times more likely to observe that mixture profile if it is a mixture of Barbara and Tod Kendhammer than if it is a mixture of Barbara Kendhammer and a random unrelated individual.
And did you also then test item B2?
Yes, item B2 was the second right-hand fingernail clipping that I tested. That was also a mixture of DNA from at least 2 individuals. Now in this particular mixture, one individual contributed more DNA to the mixture than anyone else, and I was able to call a major female contributor. That major female contributor is the female profile, a female DNA profile from that one individual who contributed the most DNA to the mixture. And that profile matched the profile that I developed from the standard from Barbara Kendhammer. I therefore concluded that Barbara Kendhammer is the source of that major female contributor DNA. Now, when I say that somebody is the source of a DNA profile, that just means that the statistical analysis that I performed is on that evidence profile is more rare than 1 in 7 trillion individuals, which is approximately 1,000 times the world's population. So instead of reporting out the stat each time, I would just report that that person is the source of the profile. So in this case, Barbara Kendhammer is the source of that major female contributor DNA. In addition, I compared Tod Kendhammer's profile to the overall mixture, and Tod Kendhammer was included as a possible contributor to that mixture profile. If we assume that DNA from Barbara is present on our own fingernails, it is at least 5,700 times more likely to observe that mixture profile if it's a mixture of DNA from Barbara and Tod than if it is a mixture of DNA from Barbara and a random, unrelated individual.
And then your result of item B3?
Item B3 was the third right-hand fingernail clipping. I also detected a mixture of DNA from at least 2 individuals from that washing. I was able to call a major female contributor again, and that major female contributor matched the DNA profile from Barbara Kendhammer. So I concluded that Barbara Kendhammer is the source of that major female contributor DNA. Tod Kendhammer was included as a possible contributor to the overall mixture profile. If we assume that DNA from Barbara is present on our own fingernails, it's at least 8.6 million times more likely to observe that mixture profile if it's a mixture of DNA from Barbara and Tod than if it is a mixture of DNA from Barbara and a random unrelated individual.
And item B5, what was your result on that?
Item B5, also a right-hand fingernail clipping. I detected a mixture of DNA from at least 3 individuals in that from that item. I called a major female contributor. That's the DNA from the one individual contributed the most DNA to the mixture. That major female contributor matched the profile from Barbara Kendhammer. Excuse me. So I concluded that Barbara Kendhammer is the source of that major female contributor DNA. I was also able to determine a major mixture component, which is approximately the DNA contribution, or the contribution of DNA from the 2 individuals who contributed the most DNA to that mixture. And Tod Kendhammer was excluded as a possible contributor to that major mixture component. I was unable to make any comparisons to the overall DNA mixture or to the minor component. So there are no conclusions to that third contributor who might be in that mixture.
Now going back to the beginning of your report, there were a number of items that you had tested from various sources. First, can you just indicate page 2 under results, there were a number of items that blood was not detected from. Can you just identify those items that no blood was found or blood was not detected?
All right. Blood was not detected on a sink stopper, which was item J. Blood was not detected on a swab from an inside garage access door, item K. Blood was not detected on swabs from a drain in the utility room, item M. Blood was not detected on a hammer, item O. And blood was not detected on swabs taken from the exterior side of the windshield under the hole, which was item D9, or the exterior side of the windshield flap, item D10, the interior side of the windshield under the hole, item D11, or the swab from the interior side of the windshield flap, item D12. And in addition, human blood is not detected on swabs from the road, which were items P, Q, R, S, and T.
Now, turning back to the DNA analysis, You identified Barbara Kendhammer's DNA as a source on a number of items listed at the bottom of page 4. Could you identify those items that she was identified as the source of the DNA? And I guess we can skip over the fingernail clippings we've already done.
All right, I developed a female STR DNA profile from a washing of one of the right-hand fingernail clippings, item B4. Barbara is the source of that female DNA. Also developed the same female DNA profile from all 5 of the left-hand fingernail clippings. That was items C1, C2, C3, C4, and C5. Barbara Kendhammer was the source of the DNA detected from those left-hand fingernail clippings. Also looked at several swabs taken from a car. Those were swabs reportedly from red-brown stains on the lower right corner of the interior passenger front door, which was item D14. The shoulder strap of the front passenger seat, item D18. The gear shift, item D20. The center of the dash, item D21. The center of the steering wheel, item D25. The interior side of the driver's door, item D32. And the interior side of the windshield, item D33. I developed the same female profile from all of those swabs from the red-brown stains. That female profile matched the profile I detected from Barbara Kendhammer. I reported that Barbara Kendhammer is the source of the DNA detected from those swabbings. In addition, I looked at a folded piece of paper. That was item D31 that was recovered from the center console of the car with some red-brown staining. I took a swabbing of that folded piece of the staining on that folded piece of paper and developed the female profile that matched Barbara Kendhammer. So I reported that Barbara Kendhammer is the source of the DNA from that, from the staining on that folded piece of paper. Also looked at a swab that was reportedly from the right rear tire of the vehicle, which was item H. I developed a female profile from that swab. That profile matched the profile from Barbara Kendhammer. So Barbara Kendhammer is the source of the DNA detected from that swab from the right rear tire of the vehicle.
Now, you also examined item D9, which is a swab from the exterior side of the windshield under the hole. Can you explain your analysis of that item?
Yes, I looked at item D9, which was the swab of the exterior side of the windshield under the hole. I developed a DNA profile that was a mixture of DNA from at least 2 individuals. One individual contributed the most DNA to that mixture, and I was able to call a major male contributor. That major male contributor matched the profile from Tod Kendhammer. I concluded that Tod Kendhammer was the source of the DNA, or of the major male contributor DNA from that swabbing. In addition, Barbara Kendhammer is included as a possible contributor to the overall mixture profile. And given that Tod Kendhammer is present in that mixture, since he is the source of the major male contributor DNA, given that he is present in the mixture, it is at least 54,000 times more likely to observe that mixture profile if it's a mixture of DNA from Tod Kendhammer and Barbara Kendhammer than if it is a mixture of DNA from Tod and a random unrelated individual.
You then analyzed a swab from the exterior side of the windshield flap that was created at that hole, item D10. Can you explain your conclusion?
In item D10, which was a swab from the exterior side of the windshield flap, I detected a low-level mixture of DNA from at least 2 individuals. That mixture was too low level for me to make any definitive conclusions about, so it was suitable for exclusionary purposes only. And I reported that the possible contribution of DNA from Tod Kendhammer and Barbara Kendhammer to that mixture profile was inconclusive. There was not enough information for me to tell either way.
You also tested item D11, a swab from the interior side of the windshield underneath that hole. Can you explain your result?
Item D11, the swab from the interior side of the windshield under the hole. I also developed a low-level mixture of DNA from at least 2 contributors. That profile was also too low-level for me to make any inclusionary statements about, and that I concluded that the possible contribution of DNA from Tod Kendhammer and Barbara Kendhammer to that mixture profile was also inconclusive.
And item D34 are swabs from the interior side of the defect in the windshield, which I assume means what was bulging outward in the center of the windshield. Can you explain your result?
Item D34 was the swabs from the interior side of the defect in the windshield. I developed a male profile. That profile matched the profile from Tod Kendhammer. Therefore, I concluded that Tod Kendhammer is the source of that male DNA.
Now, if I can have you turn to the other report, exhibit number 87. I'll need the document camera on. In that report 87, were you asked to analyze item A, which was a pipe?
That's correct.
And did you take swabbings from the pipe for the presence of blood?
Yes, that's correct. When I examined the pipe, there were numerous brown discolorations on the pipe. So I swabbed a few dozen of those brown discolorations and found 4 areas that were positive for the possible presence of blood.
Does exhibit 89 show where you swabbed for those possible presence of blood?
Yes, those are the approximate locations on the pipe where the positive tests were located. When I then went back and swabbed each of the areas around the positive test, attempting to swap up any blood or any other DNA that was present in those locations, and those 4 swabbings were sub-designated A1 through A4.
Can you explain your results of both blood and DNA for item A1?
Well, item A1 was the swabbing around that area that was phenolphthalein positive. I developed a mixture of DNA from that A1 swabbing that was consistent with being a mixture of DNA from 2 individuals. One individual contributed the most DNA to that mixture, so I was able to call a major male contributor that matched the profile that I detected from Tod Kendhammer. Therefore, I concluded that Tod Kendhammer was the source of the major male contributor DNA. I was also able to determine a minor contributor, which is the profile from the individual who contributed the lesser amount of DNA to that mixture profile. That minor contributor profile was consistent with the profile detected from Barbara Kendhammer, and the probability of randomly selecting that observed minor contributor profile from a population of unrelated individuals is approximately 1 in 800 million.
And then your results for item A2.
Item A2 was the second swabbing. I detected a mixture of DNA that was consistent with being a mixture of DNA from 2 individuals. I called a major male contributor as well that also matched the profile from Tod Kendhammer. I concluded that Tod Kendhammer was the source of the major male contributor DNA. In this particular swabbing, the minor component was too low level for me to make any conclusions about.
And then your results for item A3.
Item A3, also a swabbing, was consistent with being a mixture of DNA from two individuals. I was able to call a major male contributor. Tod Kendhammer is the source of that major male contributor DNA. With this swabbing, or with this profile, I was able to determine a minor contributor, and that minor contributor profile is consistent with the profile detected from Barbara Kendhammer. And the probability of randomly selecting that minor contributor profile from a population of unrelated individuals is approximately 1 in 609 billion.
And then the results for item A4.
Item A4 was a partial low-level mixture of DNA from at least two individuals. That profile was too low level for me to make any definitive conclusions about, so it was suitable only for exclusionary purposes. And I concluded that the possible contribution of DNA from Tod Kendhammer and Barbara Kendhammer were both inconclusive.
And these were areas that you swabbed because you had a presumptive test for blood. Is that accurate?
That's correct. There was some brownish discolorations, and when I swabbed those, I got a presumptive positive test for the possible presence of blood.
I'm showing Exhibit 88. Does this diagram show?
What was that?
What does Exhibit 88 show?
88 is a photograph of the pipe with the locations of some additional swabbings that I took on that pipe. I swabbed each quarter of the pipe as its own swabbing. So the top quarter of the pipe nearest that hexagon-shaped fitting, that swabbing was A5. Next section down is A6. Next section down is A7. The last quarter of the pipe was A8.
And why did you swab it in this way?
I was attempting to swab basically every square inch, or every square inch of the pipe, trying to detect any foreign DNA or any DNA that might have been on the pipe prior to the incident.
And then starting with the A5 swabbing, what was your results from that swab?
So the A5 swabbing, which was the swabbing of that top quarter of the pipe, I developed a DNA profile that was consistent with being a mixture of DNA from two individuals. Tod Kendhammer and Barbara Kendhammer are both included as possible contributors to that mixture profile, with the probability of randomly selecting an unrelated individual that can be included as one of the possible contributors to that profile is approximately 1 in 340 billion.
And then item A6.
Item A6, I also detected a mixture profile that was consistent with being a mixture of DNA from at least two individuals. One individual contributed the most DNA to that mixture, and I was able to call a major female contributor. And Barbara Kendhammer is the source of that major female contributor DNA. I was also able to determine a minor male contributor, and that minor male contributor is consistent with the profile detected from Tod Kendhammer, with the probability of randomly selecting that observed minor contributor profile from a population of unrelated individuals is approximately 1 in 86 billion.
And then the results on item A7.
Item A7, I developed a profile that was consistent with being a mixture of DNA from three individuals. One individual contributed the most DNA. I was able to call a major female contributor. And I concluded that Barbara Kendhammer was the source of that major female contributor DNA. I was also able to call a major mixture component, which is the contribution of DNA from the top two contributors to that mixture. Tod Kendhammer was included as a possible contributor to the major mixture component of that mixture profile. And the statistic associated with that major mixture component is approximately 1 in 18 billion. And then the minor component was too low level for me to make any conclusions about.
Was that the only place that you were finding a third individual's DNA?
I believe so, from the pipe, correct?
And item A8.
Item A8, I developed a mixture profile that was consistent with being a mixture of DNA from 2 individuals. I was able to call a major female contributor that matched Barbara Kendhammer's profile. So Barbara Kendhammer is the source of that major female contributor DNA. I was also able to determine a minor male contributor that matched the profile from Tod Kendhammer. And so I concluded that Tod Kendhammer is the source of that minor male contributor DNA.
Did you also take swabbings from the ends of the pipe?
Yes, that's correct. I took a swabbing of the hexagon-shaped fitting and threads, which I called item A9. I took a swabbing of the very end of the pipe, as well as a little bit into the interior of the pipe on the side of the hexagon-shaped fitting, which I called item A10. And I also took a swabbing of the opposite end of the pipe, the bottom end that you can see there. And the swabbing of that end I called item A11.
So then going to the hexagon-shaped fitting, you said item A9. What was the results of that swabbing of that end of the pipe?
Item A9 was the swabbing of the fitting itself and the threads. I developed a partial mixture profile, a partial low-level mixture of DNA from at least 2 individuals. However, that profile was too low level for me to make any conclusions about.
Item 10 you said was on the interior of the pipe at that end.
It was the very end of the pipe, so the exterior surface of the very end, as well as a little bit on the interior of the pipe.
And what was your result of that swabbing?
I developed a partial low-level female profile that was consistent with the profile I detected from Barbara Kendhammer, and I reported that Barbara Kendhammer was the source of that female DNA.
And then lastly, item 11 would have been at the other end of the pipe.
Item A11, I also developed a female STR-DNA profile. That female profile matched the profile from Barbara Kendhammer, and I reported that Barbara Kendhammer was the source of that female DNA.
Barbara's DNA was found on both ends of the pipe?
That's correct, yes.
What does secondary transfer mean?
All right, so when we talk about transfer, there are multiple kinds of transfer that can occur, the most common probably being primary transfer and secondary transfer. Primary transfer of DNA would be when you physically handle an object. If I were to handle this cup up here, I would expect to transfer some of my DNA to that cup directly, and that would be primary transfer. Secondary transfer would occur when DNA is transferred through an intermediate object. So if I transfer my DNA to that cup and somebody else might pick up that cup, there's a possibility that my DNA could transfer to that other individual through a secondary transfer through that cup.
Is it common for people to have DNA on items they handle normally? Household items, steering wheels, things like that?
Yes, I would expect any item that you would have any regular contact with or any object that you would handle, I would expect to transfer at least some DNA to that object.
If an object comes in contact with something you've had contact with, then it's possible that object would then pick up your DNA.
Yes, it's possible that DNA could be transferred through secondary transfer.
That's all I have from this witness, Your Honor.
Want to take a break at this point, Mr.
Sure.
Hurley?
That'd be swell.
Why don't we take at least a 10-minute break at this point? Don't talk about the case. We'll give you a heads up to come back in. You may step out. You all be seated. All right, the record could show we're back in the courtroom outside the presence of the jury. Anything before we bring the jury in, Mr. Grinke
No,
or Mr. Hurley?
I'm ready.
They're ready, bring them in. You may all be seated. All right, Mr. Hurley, you can start your cross-examination of Mr. Scott.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Scott.
Good morning.
I'm going to show you this mug which we previously marked as an exhibit in this case. Do you recognize that as something which you examined?
Yes, it is.
Okay. How did you examine it?
I visually examined it. I was looking for any larger areas of possible blood. I did not see anything that I felt warranted further testing, and that was it.
Okay, so you looked at it, you didn't see anything, so you didn't do anything further, correct?
Correct.
For the record, I think that's item 57, correct?
Thank you. I was looking for the marker. I couldn't find it.
Well, let me just clarify, is the bag marked at all? The, one you
Judge. I thought it was yesterday.
Well, let's have you give the clerk the mug, and we'll put 57 on the mug to make sure it's marked when you're done with it.
We'll do that right now.
Put it on the mug. All right, continue.
I think this goes in the bag. Not the same, not the end. Let's talk first about DNA, okay?
Okay.
Let's talk about this notion of touch DNA, that we can leave DNA by touching things. If I take Mr. Bednarik's marker here that he's been using all day and I pick it up, is it possible then for me to get Mr. Bednarik's DNA on my hand?
Yes, secondary DNA transfer through an intermediate object is possible.
And if after that I touch something else, might I leave both my DNA and Mr. Bednarik's DNA on that object?
Yes, that would be possible.
In which case we'd both have a primary transfer and a tertiary transfer, correct?
That sounds correct, yes.
what is the significance of nucleated cells to DNA?
Well, the DNA that we test for is present in the nucleus of a cell. So I would expect to find DNA in any nucleated cell within your body.
So skin would be nucleated cells,
That's correct.
fingernails as well?
I mean, fingernails themselves, I'm not sure if they have DNA in them. However, fingernails are connected to your skin and would commonly have your own DNA on the fingernails.
So you don't know whether fingernail cells are nucleated?
I'm not entirely sure.
My hair would contain nucleated cells,
The hair roots would contain nucleated cells.
and one sheds both skin cells and even hair root cells on a daily, if not hourly basis, correct?
I believe most hair would be shed, or most hair that's shed through normal occurrences would not generally contain a root or would not have a large amount of DNA in that root. But correct, you would shed skin cells and hair.
If I got Mr. Bednarik's DNA on my hand, either through a primary touch or a secondary touch or a tertiary touch, can it be washed off?
Yes, I suppose you can wash off DNA if you were to wash your hands.
Would merely running them underwater remove DNA?
I would expect it to remove some DNA. I'm not entirely sure how much DNA would remove.
Depend how much I had to begin with, correct?
I would imagine so, correct?
And the length of exposure to water, for example?
I would expect the longer an object is under running water, the more DNA might be removed.
Now, you were provided with clippings from the fingernails of Barbara Kendhammer, is that correct?
That's correct.
And may I have this device on? Thank you. What I put on screen is Exhibit 71. I'm going to represent to you that this is the right hand of Barbara Kendhammer, and that the medical examiner has told us that this is the hand from which she made the clippings that you eventually received.
Okay.
When you received the clippings, did you scrape the clippings to determine what substance was under the nails?
I did not scrape anything. I placed the clippings into a liquid and vortex them, attempting to agitate any DNA that might have been on the clippings off of the clippings and into the liquid. I then removed the clipping and performed my DNA analysis on that washing of the clipping.
So in short, you didn't look to see whether there was any flesh under the nail, is that correct?
I would expect any DNA or any flesh on the item to come off the nail during the agitation, and I would have expected to analyze that DNA as part of the washing.
So we're unable to tell from your examination whether the DNA, which you eventually isolated from the clippings, came from the surface of the clippings or from underneath the clippings, correct?
Can you clarify what you mean by surface and underneath?
Well, if I'm looking at my hand from the top, the top of the edge of my nail would be the surface, and the bottom would be underneath.
Correct. I would expect any DNA that might have been on that clipping to be transferred to the liquid.
Okay. And similarly, if the DNA were from another individual, meaning an individual other than Barbara Kendhammer, we wouldn't know the medium by which it was located underneath her fingernail if there were such a medium, correct?
Correct. I only analyzed all of the DNA that's in a sample. I don't know what cell it came from or how it got there.
So someone alleged that she scratched and that she scratched her husband, Mr. Kendhammer, and that the DNA on her fingernail clipping that belonged to Mr. Kendhammer came from that scratch. We wouldn't be able to know that from your analysis. Is that correct?
Correct. We don't know how the DNA got on any object.
You stated in your report and in your testimony today that you looked for blood on a sink stopper, item J, a swab from inside the garage access door, item K, swabs from the drain in the utility room, item M, and a hammer, item O.
That's correct.
Do you know from where these items came?
If I recall correctly, I think they came from their residence, but I'm not entirely sure.
And you said you were not able to detect blood on those items.
That's correct.
What was the method of detection that you employed?
I observed, or I looked at the items for any reddish-brown staining that might look like blood. I then swabbed a portion of that staining onto a cotton tip swab, which is an oversized Q-tip, and then tested that swab using our presumptive test, looking for a pink color change, and I did not observe any color change on those swabs, so I concluded that I did not detect blood on those items.
Okay, let me ask you some questions about this presumptive test. What test is this?
This is a Kastle-Meyer test, also known as a phenolphthalein test.
And what does it do?
It is a color change test that turns bright pink in the presence of blood, or does not.
Well, I asked my question very bad. Okay. How do you apply this phenolphthalein?
This is a two-chemical test. First, we drop some of one chemical onto the object, and then we drop a second chemical onto that object, looking for a color change after the second chemical.
You call this a presumptive test. How does a presumptive test differ from a conclusive test?
Well, a presumptive test would merely indicate the possible presence of blood in this case, because it's not specific to blood, because there are other substances out there that could make it change color, even if blood's not present. Therefore, we would call it a presumptive test. A specific test or confirmatory test would be specific to blood and would not be positive in the presence of any other substance.
And what test would that be?
In our lab, we have an additional confirmatory test for blood. We call it the hemotrace test. I did not perform a hemotrace test on any of those four objects that you listed.
Did you perform a hemotrace test on any of the objects that you did test for blood using the presumptive analysis, or the phenolphthalein test?
I do not believe so.
So in all those instances in your report and in your testimony in which you referred to a positive reaction to the presumptive test, there was no confirmation test done to determine that in fact that was blood, correct?
That's correct. We do not routinely perform confirmatory tests for blood at our lab. Typically, if we get a positive result, we would go on to DNA analysis. If blood is present on an object, I would expect to find human DNA on that object as well. Performing an additional confirmatory test would merely consume additional sample, and we just don't find that it's particularly useful in most cases to routinely perform that test.
Except that if we want to know the source of the DNA, whether it came from blood or from touch or from a secondary or tertiary touch, we really do need to perform that test, don't we?
Well, even if a confirmatory test is performed on an object, and even if blood is detected, and I would expect to find some DNA from that blood in the follow-up DNA analysis that I perform, there's no way of knowing that the profile that I might develop from that object is from the blood or not. If there is skin cells or any other DNA that's also on that object, in addition to the blood, there could be so much DNA from that other material that we might not even detect the profile from the blood. It might only detect the profile from that other source of DNA.
Let me see if I can put this in layman's terms. On occasion, you did presumptive tests for blood, which gave you a presumptive result, correct?
That's correct.
There was no confirming test to specifically identify that which reacted to the presumptive test as blood, correct?
Correct. We do not routinely confirm blood results at our lab.
And to the extent that you have said in your report and told the jury here today that DNA was present on any object, you cannot state that that DNA was from blood or from something else. Is that correct?
That's correct.
You also were provided with swabs reportedly taken from the road on which this accident occurred. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And those would be items P, Q, R, S, and T. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And you detected no blood on those swabs. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And what did you do? What was the method of detection here?
I did perform the hemotrace test on these swabs. It was reported to me that there was a possibility that it could be animal blood versus human blood, so I did not perform our...
You conducted presumptive tests which indicated the possible presence of blood on the right and left-hand fingernail clippings, correct?
That's correct.
On the left and right shoes of Mrs. Kendhammer.
I did not examine the shoes from Mrs. Kendhammer.
They were from Mr. Kendhammer.
That's correct. I did examine shoes that reportedly belonged to Tod Kendhammer.
You're correct. I misspoke, and I even had a note here that I overlooked. I apologize. You had an indication of the possible presence of blood from these swabs from the red and brown stains on the lower right corner of the interior passenger front door, item D14, correct?
Yes, I had a presumptive positive test for the possible presence of blood on that object.
As well as from the shoulder strap of the front passenger seat.
That's correct.
Also from the gear shift, correct?
Correct.
From the center of the dash.
Correct.
From the center of the steering wheel.
Correct.
From the interior side of the driver's door.
Correct.
And the interior side of the windshield.
Correct.
There was a folded piece of paper from the center console which also reacted to the presumptive test, correct?
That's correct.
You took a swab from the interior side of the defect in the windshield. Here we're talking about, once again, the outward bulge. That is if one looks at the windshield from the outside, the convex bulge.
To clarify, I did not take any of the swabbings from the car. I received those from another analyst who took those swabbings.
So with respect to your report where you said swabs from the interior side of the defect in the windshield, Do you know to what defect that refers?
I believe I do.
What is it?
I mean, I was told that there was a defect that was swabbed from the inside of the windshield. I mean, I could point it out on a photo.
Let me see if I can get it for you.
Maps 36.
I'm going to show you what's been marked as Exhibit 213. I'm going to represent to you that this has been identified as a photograph of the windshield of the Kendhammer's Camry as it was at the scene.
Okay.
You see you see many defects here, but what appear to be two principal defects, one to the left, one to the right. Can you see those?
Yes.
Okay, are you able to identify which you believe the swab you were provided with came from?
Yes, I was under the assumption that the swab we are referring to was taken from that right defect
Thank you.
when looking at that photo.
I'd like to go back to the fingernail clippings if we could. Was there, when you were provided with the fingernail clippings, were you provided with any instruction about what finger each clipping came from?
I was provided with the hand that clipping was taken from. All 5 clippings were grouped together in the same envelope. I do not know exactly which finger any of them came from.
And when you say they were grouped together in the same envelope, did they have the ability to touch one another?
Yes, they did.
And can one affect a transfer of DNA among fingernail clippings simply by having them touch one another?
I would assume so.
Let's start with the right hand. And here I'm going to go through your report in the order in which you report them. So I'm at the bottom of page 3 of 7,
Just for the record, that report exhibit number would be,
86.
thank you.
Here you detected a mixture of individuals in the fingernail. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Now, before we came back from the break, I introduced myself and shook your hand, correct?
That's correct.
And we may well have exchanged DNA, correct?
It's possible, correct?
And in the process of doing that, if our fingernails touched, or if my hand touched your fingernail, I might have deposited DNA on your fingernail, correct?
I suppose it's possible, correct?
And you on mine. It's possible,
It's
correct?
possible.
If two individuals hold hands, one would expect, and let me rephrase that, if a married couple held hands frequently, one would expect them to transfer much DNA.
Yep, I would expect more DNA to be transferred with a longer duration of contact and with more repeated frequent contacts. That's correct.
When you were testifying previously about some of the probabilities based on statistics, I noted that those probabilities increase if you have related individuals. Is that correct?
Well, two related individuals would have a higher probability of sharing similar profiles. That's correct.
Okay, so I need some clarification on profile. I have a profile, correct?
Correct.
You have a profile, correct?
That's correct.
They're not necessarily similar, are they?
No, they wouldn't necessarily be similar.
So married individuals wouldn't necessarily share similar profiles?
No, when I say related individuals, I mean biologically related, people who share biological relationships such as parent-child and siblings. Two unrelated married individuals should not be related to each other.
But when I go through your report and you give statistical analysis, very frequently, with respect to that statistical analysis, you say it is increased, that the mixture would include, for example, Barbara Kendhammer and Tod Kendhammer. The probabilities are increased above that which would occur with unrelated individuals. Is that correct?
Can you clarify that, please?
Sure. Let me find a good example of that. If we go, for example, to the top of page 4 of 7 in Exhibit 86,
Okay.
here you're examining one of the right-hand fingernail clippings, correct?
Correct.
I'm sorry.
Correct. So,
You say in there, assuming DNA from only 2 individuals in this mixture, a major female contributor can be determined at 15 genetic markers, correct?
that's correct.
So before I go further, while we're here, let me ask this question. Why do you say assuming only 2 individuals?
When we analyze mixtures and determine a major contributor, we had certain rules and calculations that we had to follow and perform, and those rules could change if it was a mixture of 2 or 3 or 4 individuals. So in this particular mixture, I used it appeared to be mostly a mixture of 2 individuals, so I used the calculations that we use for mixtures of 2 in order to determine that major female contributor.
Well, here, for example, you say an STR DNA profile that is a mixture of DNA from at least 2 individuals was detected from the washing of one right-hand fingernail clipping item B2. Did I read that correctly?
That's correct.
Okay, so let me focus on this at least. When you analyzed this, did you perceive a mixture that could contain more than 2 individuals?
The mixture appeared to me to be mostly a mixture of 2 individuals. However, there could be an additional contributor in there. However, I analyzed it as if it were a mixture of 2
Why did you do that?
because it appeared to be a mixture of 2 individuals.
But then why did you say at least 2?
There's always the possibility that another individual could be in that mixture.
So you can't eliminate that possibility, correct?
Nope, there could be 3 individuals in that mixture, but it appeared to be a mixture of 2 to me.
Prior to your analysis, did anybody give you any history of Mrs. Kendhammer from the time of the accident until the clippings were removed from her at the autopsy?
I don't recall.
So you had no information about her being hospitalized or people, family members and such, sitting with her, perhaps holding her hand?
At the time I analyzed this, I don't recall.
So you made the assumption that the mixture was from two individuals, and you found that Barbara Kendhammer is the source of this major female contributor DNA, correct?
For item B2, correct.
For item B2. Now, let me ask about nomenclature here, because you use the terms major and minor, which have a meaning in music that is totally different than they have for you, correct?
That's correct.
So, when we say major, what does that mean?
So when we have a mixture of DNA from multiple contributors, sometimes one of those contributors would appear to contribute most of the DNA to that mixture, to the point where the minor does not affect interpretation of the major profile. In this particular item, that one individual was a female, and I was able to call a major female contributor, which is that single source DNA profile from one individual. And that major female contributor profile matched the profile from Barbara Kendhammer. So I reported that Barbara Kendhammer was the source of that major female contributor DNA.
You were asked about what STR meant. Do you recall?
That's correct.
And what does it mean again?
It stands for short tandem repeat. It's the number of repeating segments of DNA that we test for.
And when you talk about major, does that mean that there's just, in a particular mixture, there's just more from one individual in that mixture than from the other?
That's correct.
So that's how we distinguish major and minor. I happen to have in this sample more from one individual than I do from another, correct?
That's correct.
And if you have roughly equal amounts, would you distinguish between major and minor?
No, if we have equal amounts of DNA, that would just appear to be a mixture of multiple individuals or two individuals, and I cannot pull out distinct single source profiles from that from that mixture profile. In that case, I would, when I make my comparisons, I would see if the profiles that I detect from the DNA standards from the known individuals are represented in that mixture profile, and if all those types are represented, I would say that that person is a possible contributor to that mixture profile.
One should not assume from the distinction between major and minor within a mixture that that necessarily means if, for example, the DNA of both individuals was placed upon the object from which the swab obtained the DNA, that it meant that the major contributor handled that object more than the minor contributor. Is that correct?
No, that is not an assumption that we can make. In general, I would expect the more that an individual handles an object, and for the longer duration that an individual handles an object, I would expect that person to transfer more DNA to that object. However, just by looking at major and minors of a mixture profile, we cannot determine anything regarding how long or how often or how long ago somebody handled an object, or even if they handled that object.
So with respect to this particular item B2, to go way back to my original question, you say, assuming that DNA from Barbara Kendhammer is present on her own, let me go back. After determining that she is the source of the major female contributor DNA within the mixture, you say Tod Kendhammer is included as a possible contributor to the overall STR DNA mixture profile, correct?
That's correct.
And why do you say, with respect to her, that she is the source, and with respect to him, that it is possible that he is a contributor?
Well, I only compared Tod Kendhammer's DNA to the overall mixture, and Tod Kendhammer appeared to be included as a possible contributor to that overall mixture.
Does that mean you're uncertain whether it's his?
Well, I would not be able to say definitively that that is him in an overall mixture like that. No,
Okay, so you're saying it's possible, correct?
that's correct, and that's why we perform a statistical analysis on our evidence profiles to provide an estimate of how frequent any or that profile might be in a general population.
So the one thing that DNA analysis can do definitively is eliminate someone as a contributor, correct?
And generally correct.
But when it comes to saying that someone is the source, one can't, it's difficult to be definitive, is that correct?
Well, when I say that somebody is the source of a particular profile, that means that our statistical analysis showed that that profile is more rare than 1 in 7 trillion individuals, which is approximately 1,000 times the world's population. Therefore, the most reasonably scientific conclusion is that that person is the source of that particular DNA, with the exception of identical siblings.
So let's dig down a little further. When you're trying to identify to whom the DNA, or from whom the DNA originated, you're looking for certain markers in the DNA, is that correct?
That's correct.
What are those called?
In general, we would call them genetic markers or loci.
Are there a certain number of genetic markers that give you confidence that the DNA came from a particular individual?
There isn't a certain number. It's all based on the statistic that we calculate.
And how do you, from where do these statistics come?
We use statistics provided to us by the FBI.
And these are statistics about characteristics of a population?
They're population frequency statistics. So in order to estimate how frequent a profile is in the population, they look at the profiles from many, many different individuals and attempt to calculate, or we can use each portion of those profiles to calculate how frequent a unknown profile might be.
How many genetic markers are there within an individual's DNA?
There are probably millions.
And how many do you look at?
With this particular item that we're talking about right now, we examined 15 genetic markers.
Out of millions, correct?
That's correct.
And it would be extraordinarily difficult to examine all the millions in all the cases that you have, correct?
Correct.
That's why you take a look at 15 and then from that apply statistical analysis to come up with a probability that the DNA originated from a certain individual, correct?
It would be a probability of randomly selecting that evidence profile from a population of unrelated individuals, but yes, that's correct.
Okay. Here, you say it is at least 5,700 times more likely to observe this STR DNA mixture profile if it is a mixture of DNA from Barbara Kendhammer and Tod Kendhammer than if it is a mixture of DNA from Barbara Kendhammer and a random unrelated individual. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Now, we know they're not related by blood, correct?
I wouldn't know that.
Well, presuming they follow the law, we know they're not as close as cousins, correct?
Okay.
And if one assumes they are unrelated by blood, why is it then that this married couple is more likely to share the mixture than it is for Barbara Kendhammer to share it with a random unrelated individual?
Well, this particular statistic that I used is called a likelihood ratio. It compares the probabilities of two events One event being the probability that it's a mixture of DNA from Barbara and Tod Kendhammer, compared to the probability that it's a mixture of DNA from Barbara Kendhammer and a random unrelated individual. That statistic was, it is at least 5,700 times more likely to observe it in that, using that assumption.
I get that, but why? Why does it make that distinction? Why does the statistical data that you apply make that distinction? Is it because it's just more likely that two married individuals are going to have mixtures of their DNA than a person would have with someone to whom they are unrelated by blood or marriage?
Well, this statistic doesn't take into effect marriage or anything like that. It merely uses how likely it is to see this this foreign DNA profile in a population of random, unrelated individuals.
But why? Do you know why?
I'm not sure I understand your question.
Does the statistical analysis which you apply distinguish between related and unrelated individuals?
Well, the statistics that are provided to us by the FBI are all from unrelated individuals, and when we apply these statistics, we assume unrelatedness. Once you start assuming relatedness, or if two individuals are related, a particular statistic might become more common in that case. Since two related individuals by blood, we would assume that there's a greater chance of sharing similar profiles.
I get that if they're related by blood, but here you're saying the mixture, you have Barbara Kendhammer as the contributor, you have Tod Kendhammer as a possible contributor, and then you say it's 5,700 times more likely to observe this mixture profile if it's from Barbara and Tod as opposed to Barbara and an unrelated person. Why is that? What is it about the statistics that make it more likely that this married couple will share DNA?
Well, the mixture that I detected appeared to be a mixture of both Tod and Barbara Kendhammer. Barbara Kendhammer was the source of that major female contributor DNA, and I would also assume that DNA from Barbara is on her own fingernails, so we can assume that Barbara's profile is present in that mixture. Looking at the foreign DNA types that Barb does not have, all of those foreign DNA types match the DNA types from Tod Kendhammer. So the statistic that I perform is a comparison of the probability of that observation, that both of them are in that mixture profile, compared to the probability of it being a mixture of Barbara and a random unrelated individual. That random unrelated individual statistic is the probability of randomly selecting those foreign DNA types that I observed in the mixture profile from the population, or from the general population.
How many markers did you get from Tod Kendhammer in this?
In this evidence profile, or?
With respect to item B2?
I don't have the number in my report.
Because again, you said it was possible. So please correct me if I'm wrong. If I'm understanding you, you say it's possible that it's Tod Kendhammer, and you're saying that because he shared the DNA sample which you analyzed had some markers in common with the profile of Tod Kendhammer. Is that correct?
That's correct. Tod is included as a possible contributor to the mixture because his types, or his profile, is represented in that mixture.
He's included as a possible contributor. And the analysis the statistical analysis that it's probably his is simply because you have some of his markers, correct?
That's correct.
You also say with respect to this that there are two low-level STR DNA types from an additional possible trace contributor were also detected in this mixture profile. And here, I don't mean to fault you at all, but there's a difference in tense that I don't understand. Two low-level STR DNA types from an additional possible trace contributor were also detected. Are you saying we had two types from one additional person?
So in this particular mixture profile, there are two trace types that are, so these trace types are very low level, and I was unsure, I guess, if those types came from an additional third contributor to the mixture, or if those types were merely an artifact of the DNA analysis that we perform. Either way, these two low-level types did not interfere with the interpretation of the overall profile. So I'm just merely acknowledging their presence by that line. They could be from another contributor. They might not be. Either way, I can't make any conclusions about them.
I'm going to ask you to listen to my question, because very often I ask you a question that you could answer with yes or no, and you never do. So if you can answer it with yes or no, I'd appreciate it. Are you saying that the two low-level STR DNA types come from a single individual or two individuals?
That's not something I could determine, or even if they came from no individuals.
Let's go to item B3. Here you find, with respect to another fingernail clipping from the right hand, DNA from two individuals in a mixture. At 15 genetic markers, you determine that Barbara Kendhammer is the source of the major female contributor, correct?
That's correct.
Again, Tod Kendhammer is included as a possible contributor. Is that correct?
That's correct.
If we move on to item B5, again, a clipping from the right hand. You found a mixture containing DNA from at least 3 individuals, correct?
That's correct.
Barbara Kendhammer is the source of the major female contributor to the DNA. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Here, Tod Kendhammer is excluded as the possible contributor to the major mixture component of the DNA profile, correct?
Correct.
And you have STR data obtained from the low-level minor component does not support any comparison to other DNA profiles due to the limited amount of genetic material available, correct?
That's correct.
So we have Barbara Kendhammer on one of the right-hand fingernails plus 2 other people who are unidentified on that fingernail, correct?
That's correct.
And certainly if she had been in the hospital and medical staff or family touched her hands or her fingernails, it is possible for them to have been the source of that other DNA, correct?
I suppose that's correct.
You found the same female STR DNA profile in the washing of one right-hand fingernail clipping. So if the jury were to read this report later and see that, when you say the same female STR DNA profile was detected in the following items, are you referring to the profile of Barbara Kendhammer?
That's correct. Barbara was the source of the DNA from that list.
So just so that nobody would be misled, I'm going to hand you a pencil. And next to that line, would you simply write BK on the exhibit?
Are you asking him to change an exhibit that's been received?
I'm asking him to mark on the exhibit, Your Honor.
You're not gonna change any exhibits that have been received. You're gonna do a new exhibit, you can do a new exhibit.
Let me show you what's been marked as Exhibit 220. Is that identical to the exhibit that you've been looking at?
It would appear so, yeah, correct.
I'm going to give you a red pen. Would you put the initial BK by that sentence that I pointed out to you?
Okay.
Just for the record, Mr. Hurley, that refers to an alteration of Exhibit 86, is that right?
Well, that's a new exhibit, Your Honor,
I know
which
this
is identical to Exhibit 86.
Thank you. You want me to receive that exhibit?
I would move it into, well, there may be other markings, Your
Go
Honor.
ahead then.
You also detected Barbara Kendhammer's profile in the left-hand fingernail clippings, is that correct?
That's correct.
You detected her DNA from the red-brown stains in the lower right corner of the interior passenger front door, correct?
That's correct.
Also from the shoulder strap of the front passenger seat,
That's correct.
from the gear shift,
Correct.
from the center of the dash,
Correct.
from the center of the steering wheel,
Correct.
from the interior side of the driver's door,
Correct.
and from the interior side of the windshield.
Correct. And to clarify, those are all swabbings of red-brown stains.
All swabbings of red-brown stains, correct?
Correct.
But again, you're unable to distinguish unable to determine from DNA analysis whether those red-brown stains were all caused by direct contact with Barbara Kendhammer or by the transfer of Barbara Kendhammer's blood from someone who had gotten it on their hands, correct?
Correct. I don't know where the DNA would have come from.
Similarly, her blood was, or there was a red-brown stain on a folded piece of paper from the center console of the Kendhammer vehicle from which you detected her profile, correct?
That's correct.
Additionally, from the right tire of the vehicle, a swab from the red-brown stain reflected her profile, correct?
That's correct.
You also detected low-level STR DNA types from additional possible trace contributors in the mixture profiles detected in the washings of the left-hand fingernail clippings from Barbara Kendhammer, correct?
That's correct. These were low-level types. They could be from an additional possible contributor or contributors, or they could be artifacts of our DNA analysis. However, I'm not making any conclusions about those.
Now, there was a swab from the exterior side of the windshield under the hole in the windshield, correct?
Correct, item D9.
Item D9. You examined that, and Tod Kendhammer is the source of this major male contributor DNA, correct?
That's correct.
Barbara Kendhammer is also included as a possible contributor to that mixture profile, correct?
That's correct.
And again, you are unable to tell whether if Barbara Kendhammer was the contributor, her DNA was directly deposited by contact with her or her blood, or whether that represented a transfer of her DNA.
That's correct.
There was a swab from the exterior side of the windshield flap. And here we're talking about that flap of glass, correct?
I would assume so.
Here you find a mixture of at least 2 individuals.
That's correct.
It includes at least one major, or at least, it includes at least one male contributor, correct?
That's correct.
It was suitable for exclusionary purposes, correct?
That's correct.
Because there was a very limited amount of genetic information.
That's correct. It was a low-level mixture.
And you said the possible contribution of DNA from Tod Kendhammer and Barbara Kendhammer is inconclusive, correct?
That's correct.
Unable to tell.
Correct.
Here you look, next you looked at a swab from the interior side of the defect in the windshield. Item D34.
Yes, that's correct.
When you say the defect here, you're referring to the same defect as previously, correct? That you previously identified from the photograph of the windshield?
Correct. That was the defect I was told that swab came from.
Tod Kendhammer is the source of the DNA detected from this item, correct?
That's correct.
And that's the interior side from the
From inside the car.
interior of the vehicle.
That's what I was told. Correct.
Barbara Kendhammer was excluded as the source of the DNA from that swabbing, correct?
That's correct.
Two low-level STR DNA types from an additional possible trace contributor were also detected on the mixture profile, but there was no conclusion regarding who those possible low-level trace contributors were.
Correct. Those 2 trace types may have been from a trace contributor. They may have been artifacts of our DNA analysis. Either way, they were very low level and did not interfere with the analysis of the male profile, and I'm not making any conclusions about those types.
When you say artifacts of our DNA analysis, what does that mean in layman's terms?
When we perform DNA analysis, we use instruments to detect these DNA types of a profile, and occasionally an artifact that doesn't come from DNA but may just be from the process itself may occur. They're typically low level and don't impact the analysis of the profile as a whole, but they do occur every so often, and in this particular case I couldn't tell if these types were from that sort of artifact or if they were actually from another contributor. But either way, they were very low level, and I'm not making any conclusions about them.
If you wanted to break, this would be a good breaking point, otherwise I'm
want,
fine
we
going
can-
ahead.
We can do that. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I'll have you step out again for at least a 10-minute break. Don't talk about the case. We'll give you a heads up before we ask you back. Scott, you can step down if you'd like. Let the record can show we're outside the presence of the jury. Just for lunch purposes, about how much time do you think we'll both take with Mr. Scott yet? Everybody can be seated.
15, 20 minutes for me.
How much more?
And then you want to start your next witness before lunch?
That would take us to, I would think so.
You want to?
Unless you want to take lunch early, 11:30.
Well, that's what I'm asking. We can do lunch a little early. I just have to order it in advance. You think you'll be done about 11:30? Both of you with this witness?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, why don't we do that then? Okay? All right, we'll be in recess.
Please rise.
Everybody be seated. Okay, the record can show we're back in the courtroom outside the presence of the jury. Ready to proceed?
I'm ready, Your Honor.
If the jury's ready, you can bring them in. Okay, you may all be seated. Right, Mr. Hurley, you may continue with your cross, and Mr. Scott?
Madam Clerk, may I have this device, please? Just want to ask you a few questions about the pipe that in exhibits 89 and 88. Here you stated you did a presumptive test for the possible presence of blood, correct?
That's correct.
And again, there was no confirmatory test, correct?
That's correct.
So having done the presumptive test, you then took swabs from the areas that you thought had reacted to the presumptive test, correct?
That's correct.
But because no confirming test has been done, one can't definitively identify whether the DNA that you detected in your subsequent analysis was deposited onto the pipe by blood or by touch or by some other means, correct?
That's correct.
And if by touch, one can't determine whether it was a primary touch, a secondary, or tertiary, correct?
That's correct.
The with respect to area A1, here you found a mixture of DNA with Tod Kendhammer being the source, a major source, and Barbara Kendhammer being a minor contributor, correct?
That's correct.
With respect to area A2, again, a mixture that included Tod Kendhammer, but the minor contributor could not be determined.
That's correct. Cannot be determined due to the limited amount of genetic material, so I did not make any conclusions to the minor for the A2 swabbing.
With respect to the area A3, a mixture again with Tod Kendhammer being the major contributor, correct?
That's correct.
Here you say Barbara Kendhammer is consistent. Why the use of the term consistent?
Well, the minor contributor profile that I determined was consistent with the profile that I determined, or that I detected from Barbara Kendhammer, with the statistic associated with that being 1 in 609 billion.
So let me go back in your report to that. And here we're talking about your report is Exhibit 87 with respect to the pipe, correct?
Correct.
I'm just trying to understand your terminology, okay?
Okay.
You say a major male contributor can be determined. Tod Kendhammer is the source of this major male contributor DNA, right?
That's correct.
A minor contributor can be determined, but you don't say that Barbara Kendhammer is the minor contributor. You say that her profile is consistent.
That's correct. Since the stat was less rare than 1 in 7 trillion, in this case it was 1 in 609 billion, I did not report that she is the source of that minor contributor profile. I stated that minor contributor profile is consistent with the profile detected from Barbara Kendhammer.
In layman's terms, does that mean maybe she is, maybe she isn't, but if I apply the statistical analysis, she probably is?
That's what I would take away from it, correct?
Okay. That's all I wanted to know. Finally, item A4, again, a mixture of 2 individuals, correct?
That's correct.
And here, you say the possible contribution of DNA from both Tod Kendhammer and Barbara Kendhammer to this mixture profile is inconclusive due to the limited amount of genetic information available, correct?
That's correct. This was a partial low-level mixture.
In layman's terms, you couldn't tell.
Exactly.
I'll show you now Exhibit 89 on the screen.
Say 89,
Yes, sir.
it's 88.
Did I confuse the two?
The last one was 89.
Okay, when I showed these to you, I had mismarked them with respect to the ones I used on screen. So the prior exhibit to which I referred, I had said 88 when in actuality it's 89. Is that correct?
Oh, that appears to be an annotated version.
Oh, that's mine. I think I showed you 89, and I think I may have referred to it as 88. And if I did, I apologize, and I'd like to make the record clear that my prior questions addressed Exhibit 89. Now I'll show you 88. Thank you, Judge, for having corrected me. I want to talk to you for a minute about how you took the swabbings of each quadrant about which you testified earlier this morning, okay?
Okay.
How'd you do it?
I used cotton tip swabs being basically large Q-tips. I wet one of the swabs with water and swabbed over the entirety of that one quadrant, all over the pipe. Then followed that up with an additional dry swab, attempting to capture any remaining cellular material or DNA that might be that might be on the pipe. Then extracted or attempted to extract DNA from these swabs and the material that the swabs collected.
Okay. We have here the pipe. This has been marked as Exhibit 54 previously. And I want to be careful because I don't want to put my DNA in. Would this approximate what I'm exposing through the paper here? Would this approximate Section A5?
Approximately, yeah.
Okay. When you say that you swabbed this area, did you take, if you could take that red pen and just, without touching this, kind of show the jury what you did with the swab?
I mean, I just swab, trying to cover every square inch of it.
So you did the entire circumference?
That's correct.
Okay. And you did that with respect to each quadrant?
That's correct.
So when one examines, when subsequently one examines those swabs to detect DNA, one can't say from where on the quadrant DNA had been located. Is that correct?
That's correct.
If one looks in the lower right-hand square on Exhibit 88, this would be the end of the pipe without the nut or flange, correct?
Correct.
I'm going to show you what was previously admitted as Exhibit 39. Is this the end that would have been A11?
I believe so.
Here, you noticed that the end had orange sand and dirt. Is that correct?
That's correct.
You said that Barbara Kendhammer is a source of DNA detected from this end, correct?
That's correct.
Can you tell the jury where you put the swab on that end?
Yep, it was just the very end of the pipe, the surface that you can see in this photo.
Did you put it on the interior?
I don't believe I swabbed the interior of this end.
Go back to Exhibit 88. And here, in the upper left-hand box, we see the end of the pipe with the nut. Is that correct?
That's correct.
That would be labeled A9 in your analysis, correct?
That's correct, as well as A10.
I'm showing you what was previously admitted as Exhibit 41. This would be the nut end of the pipe, correct?
It would appear so, correct?
And that would correspond to your examination of A9, A10.
That's correct.
Here, you detected a low level of DNA from a female that you found to be the DNA of Barbara Kendhammer. Is that correct?
For the A10 swabbing, that's correct.
Please tell the jury where you swabbed on this end.
This end was the very end of the pipe, similar to the A11 swabbing, the very edge that you can see in this photo, as well as a little bit into the interior of the pipe.
And because the same swab was used, one doesn't know whether that DNA was on the outside, the inside, or the edge. Is that correct?
That's correct.
You also had a partial low-level profile of two other individuals from that swabbing. Is that correct?
For the A9 swabbing, which was the swabbing of the fitting itself and the threads around it.
When you say the fitting itself, to what do you refer if you're looking at Exhibit 41?
I refer to the hexagon-shaped flange in the threads.
And you were able to draw no conclusions about whose DNA that was. Is that correct?
Correct. There are at least two individuals in that low-level mixture. However, I can't make any conclusions or comparisons to that profile.
If we go back now to Exhibit 88, I'd like to talk about the two lower quadrants of the pipes of the pipe as it is depicted on Exhibit 88. That would be areas of sections A7 and A8. Okay?
Okay.
Tell me when you're there.
Yep.
With respect to section A7, that's the upper of the two as we're looking at it on the screen.
Correct.
3 individuals' DNA were detected, is that correct?
That's correct. There's a mixture of DNA from at least 3 individuals.
The major female contributor is Barbara Kendhammer,
That's correct.
and she's the major contributor to the mixture, is that correct?
That's correct.
And Tod Kendhammer is a possible contributor to that mixture, is that correct?
That's correct.
But the third individual's DNA was too low level to be able to identify, is that correct?
That's correct.
And again, one can't tell whether the DNA of any of the 3, withdraw that and start again. One can't tell the manner in which the DNA of any of the 3 have been deposited onto this pipe, correct?
That is correct.
And finally, with respect to section A8, you had a mixture from 2 individuals that you determined to be a mixture of Tod and Barb Kendhammer's DNA. Is that correct?
Correct. Barb was the major female contributor, and Tod was the source of the minor male contributor.
Grab that if you want to see. No, that one.
Okay.
I would move Exhibit 220 into evidence, Your Honor.
Any objection? No objection. Be received.
Thank you. I have no further questions of the witness.
Rink, you have any
Thank you,
additional,
Mr. Smith.
correct?
Yes, Your Honor. Just a couple. Mr. Scott, you were asked about your statistical analysis involving unrelated or related random people. Does your statistical analysis have anything to do with people who are married?
No, it does not.
What do you mean by the term unrelated when you use that term, or related?
Unrelated individuals would be individuals who do not share a blood relation with each other.
In the statistical analysis, does living together or being together a lot or being married have anything to do with the probabilities that you're talking about?
No, it does not.
And the swabs that you took from the pipe that you indicated had a presumptive positive test for blood, you said there were some possibilities for false positives with that test?
Correct. There are other substances that could induce a color change even if blood's not present.
And I think you said on direct that was iron one of them?
Rust is a commonly quoted one.
Rust is something that would give you a false positive?
It could.
Is there any way of knowing in this case if the rust on the pipe caused the color change versus blood?
No, I don't believe there is any way to tell that, just using the test that I did.
Is the pipe an old pipe that had rust on it in various places?
There could have been rust on there. There was lots of different discolorations and sand and soil.
That's all I had, Your Honor.
As a scientist, you would never engage in speculation about the source of the cause for the presumptive test to be positive. Is that correct?
I suppose so.
You're unable to say whether the positive reaction to a presumptive test was from blood or from rust or from anything else. Is that correct?
Correct.
And if one were to draw a conclusion one way or the other, one would have to engage in sheer speculation. Is that correct?
Using the test that I've performed, correct.
Nothing else? No. Okay, at this time, does any juror have a question of Mr. Scott? At least one? Anyone else? Okay, maybe 209. Five oh nine. 509.
He wants much to lose.
I got one more for now, but you give me a.
Maybe he's
Okay.
close, she is.
Yeah, no, and her reaching.
No. Thank you.
One more. We got two different jurors right now. Right, Mr. Scott, we have two juror questions here. The first one is Exhibit 509. If you can answer this, can you say how many DNA markers are associated with a strong match versus a weaker match, if you understand that question?
No, we don't count the number of markers in a match. We rely solely on the statistical analysis. The statistical analysis can vary depending on a certain number of markers. If they are rare markers, you might get a more rare stat, even if you have less of them than match with more markers, but have a more common markers, that sort of thing. We only rely on the statistical analysis, not the number of markers.
Okay, and then the question marked as Exhibit 510. Could the rust scales on both ends of this pipe where DNA was found transfer DNA elsewhere, say in a car, if those rust scales fell off?
I suppose if there was DNA on the rust scales and they came into contact with other portions of the pipe, it's possible that it could be transferred. I'm not entirely sure.
Okay. Hey, anything else?
I'm confused, so I need you to educate me. We talked earlier about 15 markers. What is the significance of 15 markers?
In that particular test that we used for DNA analysis, it tested for 15 markers. That's just the number of markers that that test contained.
So when you say we don't count the number of markers, I believe what you said is when we have a match, we don't count the number of markers, we rely on the statistics.
Correct. I don't say that there's a match at 3 of 15 markers or anything like that. We only perform the statistical analysis on the markers that are suitable for statistics.
What are suitable for statistics?
I mean, there are a various number of rules that we follow when interpreting these profiles. If a portion of the profile might be too low level, it might be unreliable for statistics, so we would not be able to use that particular marker for statistics. So when we perform our statistical analysis, we only use those markers that we have deemed suitable or strong enough to support a statistical analysis.
Is 1 sufficient?
Generally, no.
2?
Generally, no.
3?
In this particular test, so when we talk about 15, that was in the first report that I generated, dated December 2nd. That was basically everything I examined except for the pipe. So in that report, and for that analysis, we tested for 15 genetic markers. And in order to use a portion of the profile for statistics, that profile needed to be more common or more rare than 1 in 200 individuals. So that is the statistical cutoff that we used at that time. It was not the number of markers.
So you're telling me that there's the potential to use only 1 marker?
Generally, no.
Well, I'm trying to get a feel for what's the minimum number you need before you can apply the statistical analysis.
Well, in the second report that I performed,
Which is the second?
the second one is the one dated May 2nd. That was the report that I wrote after I examined the pipe. So the testing.
Can you give the exhibit number? We need to do that for the record.
Oh, sorry, that was Exhibit 87, the pipe report. So for this particular item that I examined, the DNA analysis that I performed used 23 genetic markers, and in order to be able to make comparisons to any portion of the profile, the minimum number of markers in this case would be eight markers.
8 of 23.
That's correct, and I don't believe there was a minimum for the 15 markers that we used for the other items.
So is it possible that with respect to all the other items other than the pipe, where you were using a test for 15 markers, that you used as few as 1?
No, there's not.
What is the least number that you used with respect to all of the items other than the pipe?
I don't recall. I do have my case notes here. I could spend 15 minutes looking through it. if you wish, but I don't recall offhand.
How about you take a look over the lunch break? Would that be acceptable to you,
You're
Your Honor?
asking for a break now, is what you're saying.
Rather than have us wait 15 minutes.
That's fine. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we'll take our noon recess now for about an hour. We'll shoot for about 20 to 1 to be back. We'll give you a heads up before we call you in, of course. Don't talk about the case. Enjoy your lunch, and we'll see you soon. I don't know. Probably shouldn't. Don't ask this question, but I don't want that. Record can show we're outside the presence of the jury. Everyone can be seated or go to lunch. And I guess for the record, the witness is asking for clarification, so if both counsel wants to see what to clarify, we can do it off the record, and I'll help him search. Otherwise, we'll be in recess.